People who knew a murderer, what were the signs they were going to kill someone? Before we start, welcome back to Reddit Stories Hub. If you're new here, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Here we'll be telling you interesting, thought-provoking stories from Reddit. So get comfortable and let's jump right in. Story 1. He was a good friend of mine. The biggest sign of him not being well was claiming he was talking to something via the console menu of his internet browser. I told him it was just the background code, but he refused to believe it. He'd always been wacky and attention-seeking, so I just left it. 2 weeks later, he killed his family. Turns out this time it was real. The biggest thing to take away is that if someone starts talking 0 cents, consider why. It's not going to happen to 99% of people, I'm sure, but I somewhat regret not taking him seriously. Story 2. My parents fostered kids growing up. We had a kid that was with us from around 14 years old till he was 16. He was always involved in gangs. He would also steal knives from our house and bring them to school. I was probably around 12 at the time, but he seemed like a fine dude besides always needing to prove his toughness. We definitely had angrier guys through the years that never ended up hurting anyone, to my knowledge. Anyways, he was at a nightclub and got into a fight with some guy, walked straight up to him and shot him in the face. Got life in prison. My dad reached out to him, and he still denies that it was him. Definitely doesn't seem to be remorseful. I would have never thought him a murderer compared to other guys we fostered. I think it just takes the right circumstances. Maybe the knives at school were a sign. Story 3. I was like 17, and this 21-year-old dude asked me on a date. His friend was dating my friend and neighbor, so I was like, sure. This guy wrote about the number of miles to my house and knocked on my door because he knew where I lived. I didn't come out, and he moped outside for like an hour, texting me before he gave up. This freak ended, and my friend ended up dating for a bit years later. Then he told her he wanted to have kids so that he could have sex with them. No joke, she was out of there. That pig is in prison now for raping an underage girl. No surprise. Story 4. Sat next to him in choir class. He was always kind of off. He operated on his own wavelength, constantly in his own world, never really engaging with anybody. People just didn't really exist on his radar. On a class trip, we slept in the same hotel room, and he walked around naked, like I wasn't even there. I always assumed he was autistic, but in hindsight, it might have been something much worse, like schizophrenia. He never seemed violent, but nobody ever talked to him enough to ever make that conclusion in the first place. A few months ago, he beat and stabbed his mother to death with a kitchen knife. It was so bad dental records were needed to identify the body. He cut off one of her breasts and implied in his confession that he ate part of it. He waited until his dad came home from work to show him what he'd done, claimed he saw a sign from the devil that told him to kill her. That may have been a lie. From what I heard, he was very excited to tell the police what he had done. And from what I do know about him, he might have said it for attention. He turned himself in, waived his Miranda rights, and confessed to everything. When the cops found him, he was literally soaked in blood. He refused to shower it off, so they had to hose him down before they put him in a cell. He's looking at 40 years in prison. His mom was an amazing woman. She tailored our suits for choir and was constantly volunteering. If there was an event, she was there. She was going to be her town's councilwoman next year. She loved her son very much. She didn't deserve to die like that. Story 5. We were science labs partners. He was a little weird and creepy, but always nice in his own odd way to me. We F off a good deal in that class, drawing pictures and making up stupid products that we could create and sell in the future. People joked he was going to be a serial killer because he fit the vibe, was creepy, bullied, dressed in all black, etc. He was a total dick to everyone else, would threaten them, etc. But we were always cool. I was nice to him because I didn't have many friends. Same as him, and like I said, he was always nice to me. One day, he drew me a picture. It had a stick figure getting attacked by a grappling hook, then a couch with a smiley face on it. The caption on the drawing was, "I will kill you and make a sofa out of your skin." Of course, in high school I laughed it off. He actually killed someone a few years later, stabbing them dozens of times over a computer. I'm glad I was nice to him. I also still have the drawing. Story 6. I grew up with one of the most callous, unimaginable bullies who got away with everything for years because his parents were respected, high-ranking members of society. He was exploitative, violent, and sexually deviant towards his targets. He would kidnap family pets, kill them, and then show the videos to people at school. He was also very selective in who he targeted. He would go for the absolute weakest and lowest on the food chain, and often would bully and harass them in private instead of at school or on the bus because he did not want any resistance, and they were more vulnerable when not around others. A friend of mine was assaulted by him, and she recounted that he figured out that her parents did not arrive home from work for a few hours after she got back from school. He would show up at her house and attempt to charm his way inside until she eventually rebuffed him, and he broke in and tried to coerce her into having sex with him. She refused, and at that point he physically assaulted her and threatened her. This was all ignored, and it just showed how much you can get away with if you know or are related to the right people. A few years after graduation, he attempted to murder a girl and assaulted another in a similar fashion to how he assaulted my friend. He was put away for a very long time and passed away from natural causes in prison before age 35. Story 7. It said, a kid lived down the street from me and used to come to my house to play with my older sibling. My mom always thought he was a bit weird. One day he told my mom he liked to kill squirrels for fun. He was 5 or 6 at the time. He wanted my sibling to join him. My mom stopped letting him come over. The kid moved away a year later to Kentucky. Fast forward about 15 years. Mom turns on the news. The kid, she remembered his name, brutally killed both of his parents. He was college-aged. Story 8. I knew a kid I was friends with when I was 6 or 7. He used to tell me he had a serial killer that shared a body with him that had some different name and everything. I remember one time the serial killer personality came out when we were playing video games, and he forced me out of my room and wouldn't let me come in. Another time when my back was turned, he carved the serial killer's initials into my dresser with a knife. After the second one, my parents stopped letting me hang out with him. Then he moved away, and I never saw him again. In hindsight, I think he had a lot of traumas. I think his parents were alcoholics, and he was in and out of homelessness. He never let me come over to his house. I did once, and the vibe was weird. Anyway, 25 years later, looking back, that was some alarming behavior. Sometimes I wonder where he is these days, but I don't remember his name and wouldn't know how to check in. Story 9. One of the regular customers at the grocery store I worked at 20+ years ago was a real creepy guy. The best way I could describe him was cold. Just cold. You couldn't really make small talk with him or chat as you rang up his grocery order. In fact, he hardly talked at all, and when he did, he was just cold. The guy had a real physical presence, too. He was probably about 300 pounds with wide shoulders, big arms, and a broad chest. Not a nice man and not someone you wanted to be around if you could help it. And he never, ever, smiled. His face was set in a permanent glower. Anyway, it turned out he had been abusing his wife and kids for years. Had a creepy, bigamous, incestuous cult thing going, where he also married his wife's sisters and his own daughters, and had all kinds of kids by multiple wives. Eventually, some of the women overcame their fear of him and alerted the authorities. But when the cops came to arrest him, he barricaded himself in the house and wouldn't come out. When he finally did come out, it turned out he'd been stalling the cops to have time to murder all the kids that were in the house. I think he killed 8, 9 of his own kids. And that wasn't the only mass murderer who shopped at our store either, but he was the worst. Story 10. So, I went to a big university that had a weird, close-knit feel. There was this girl that I knew, but I wasn't friends with. She was nice, but very over-the-top, bubbly, enthusiastic about everything, and super extroverted. She was just a little much for me, good in very, very small doses. She started dating this guy who was the opposite of her. Shy, quiet, followed her around like a little puppy. I can't remember now if it was over a holiday break, like Thanksgiving or Christmas, or if it was just a weekend. But we all found out that his parents, younger brother and dog, were all killed in a house fire. Everyone felt so bad for him. Her family took him in. Support poured out from everywhere. Then we find out he killed all of them and then set the house on fire to cover it up. Shocked everyone. Story 11. I had a friend in high school. We were from very different cliques. He was a big football jock, and my friends were more the pot-smoking hippie type. We were just friends, not dating, but people were always surprised to see us together since we came from such different friend groups. He was kind, sweet, and tender-hearted. Walking arm in arm with him felt safe, and I really loved him. I remember him telling me about his drunken, abusive father, but other than his life seemed charmed. When I moved, we wrote letters to each other for a time, but then that faded away. Many years later, the internet became a thing. He was one of the first people I looked up and found. He was homeless, but had been working in a restaurant. He had gotten in a fight with another homeless guy and killed him. It breaks my heart to this day. Story 12. We hadn't lived in that state for very long. A friend of my husband's had us over for dinner and to meet a couple about all our ages. I thought the male half was terribly good-looking, in an aging hippie or artist way. He was thoughtful, introspective, philosophical, very well educated, and quite funny. We were so glad to enlarge our circle a little bit. The mutual friend threw his annual Christmas party, and we met the new couples, two little girls, tiny angels in Wizard of Oz spangly ruby slippers, who spent the party running to bring my husband coffees. Anyway, the guy shot his wife, went upstairs, shot his daughters, set the house on fire, then wandered around in it a while before shooting himself. No, I saw no signs. Story 13. Generally, a lot of pent-up aggression from being failed by the system and, in part, his family. He was abused by his biological father, and so the family broke apart, and he lived with his mama and young sister. Fast forward a few years, and she gets a slimy new boyfriend who was Muslim and tried to convert the family. He wouldn't let the kids watch any Western cartoons or TV, and did absolutely nothing around the home. He would sit like a slug, while the kid's mom did absolutely everything, and eventually he started picking fights with her son. He felt oppressed and ignored and would scream or run away, which was met with punishment from the new boyfriend. She eventually left him, but he stalked the family, and so she had to move away. Won't specify the area they went to, but it was rife with gang activity, and he quickly joined in. A couple of years later, he stabbed another boy on a night out, and he died. He's in prison for life. My heart breaks every time I think of what a sweet lad he was and could have been if things had been different. There was absolutely no support from schools, and he never had any counseling. If he had found other ways to deal with the rage and hurt, he had, and didn't get caught up in a gang, then things would have been different, I think. Story 14. Went to school with him. He was a year ahead of me. His dad owned a local gas station repair shop, but the dad died when the son was 9 or 10. Rumors were that he terrorized his mom, as it was only the two of them trying to keep the business going. Like he would demand money from her, and if she tried to stop him from taking the car, when he was a young teenager, too young to drive, he would tie her up and lock her in a closet, steal money from the cash register, and be gone all weekend. He dated the daughter of the local school board president, and when they broke up, he stalked and terrorized her and her dad, had his first restraining order at 15 or 16. Those were rumors, things I know for sure. At 13, he and I were on a baseball team together. We would ride bikes to the field. One day, while we were waiting on bleachers before practice, he arrived and threw my parked bike to the ground for no reason. Maybe he thought it was in his way. Bending a wheel. I said something to him, and he cursed me, then sat on the bleachers behind me and kicked me with a flat foot, jamming the bottom of his foot with metal baseball spikes into my back as hard as he could. All started off for no reason but his anger issues. When he was a senior, he was a big star in the school's wrestling that was going for a state championship. The week before, he showed up at school drunk, which got him suspended to miss the state meet, till he found a judge to issue an injunction so he could compete. Didn't keep up after high school. In his 20s, they found his pregnant GF murdered in a hotel room in Niagara Falls. Our hometown was halfway across the country from there. It was later determined that he had jumped over the falls to his death. Story 15. The murderer was my son's godfather, Michael, who killed his ex-wife and her fiancé. But the story needs context to understand just how bizarre this was. Michael came into my husband's life when he was a kid. He was seeking medical services from my husband's father, a doctor, that he paid for with lobsters he trapped, but also with tutoring he provided to the doctor's kids. Michael was a brilliant college student, that became a brilliant physicist. Michael married the love of his life, Marilyn. She was wonderful, was involved in many civic works like a statewide anti-bullying campaign. Great couple. We asked them to be our son's godparents. They were together 45 years. Then something happened. Michael had been ill. His wife had been caring for him. He was better that they were about to go out for another boat adventure. They had had many over the years. But Marilyn somehow broke her hip and never came home, left him, moved across the state to her sister's, got divorced. I always thought there was more to the broken hip story. So this was the red flag. Michael flipped out, sent out blast emails to everyone that Marilyn had lost her mind, that she had to come home, and everyone should convince her. Some time passed. It was nice to know that at age 69 you can meet a new guy she had and was about to be wed. Michael hunted them down and killed them and tried to burn their boat. He had on him a gun, a knife, twist-tie handcuffs, a dildo, and Viagra, so what the hell was he planning? At his trial he claimed temporary insanity, but was found guilty. Then, the day before sentencing, he threw himself off the second floor of the jail to his death. They had 3 beautiful sons and 3 beautiful grandchildren. Why couldn't he just kill himself? I loved Marilyn. Story 16. My cousin murdered his wife when he was 21 and is still in prison. When we were kids, we were really close. He was like a brother to me. I lived with my grandparents, and their house was where all the family gathered. His father would beat him brutally. When he would get away from him, he would take off running through the woods. The woods led to our house. They were about 3 miles, as the crow flies, apart. The first time I remember it happening, I was maybe 6, and he was like 10. At that point, it had been going on for years. He would just show up in the middle of the night and go to bed. Later on, my grandpa got a camper, and he would just go in there. I remember his back, legs, stomach, and pretty much his whole body being black and blue. You could see the strap marks from a belt. He would crawl in the bed with me, and we would just hold each other until he stopped shaking and went to sleep. It was awful. Of course, later on he became a bully. If he loved you, he'd protect you fiercely, and you were safe. If you crossed him, you would be having a really bad day. His nickname was Crowbar. He always had it with him, though he didn't need it, because he grew to be 6'3" and somewhere around 220 pounds of pure muscle. Nobody ever wanted to be on his bad side. Then he met a girl. He calmed down. He got a job. He got a house. He was so happy. I had never seen him happy. I remember thinking that this was all he ever needed. Someone to love him and someone for him to love back. They were together a little over a year. She cheated on him, and now he's doing life. He's had problems in prison. He escaped 3 times. So it adds time, fighting and such. This all happened in the 1970s and early 1980s. He's been locked up since 1983. Don't ask me why my family didn't help him, because I just don't know. I was a child. Story 17. No signs at all. Most didn't believe it or made excuses for him. He was the assistant wrestling coach at my high school, and I trained with him many times. He was chill and nice when I knew him. He shot his friend dead a few years after I graduated. The story is that he got drunk at a party and got in an argument with his friend. The next day, he drove to his friend's house to apologize. Instead, they got in a fist fight, and my coach fell off a porch and hit his head. My coach drove home, got his gun, drove back to the friend's house, and shot him. My coach told police that his friend had come at him with a knife. The jury convicted him. A number of my friends believed that our coach was in a strange mental state after hitting his head, which made him temporarily crazy. Story 18. I served as a church missionary. At one point, I got transferred to an area where the missionary's prior had been teaching a mildly eccentric but friendly and kind man for a couple months. We met with him for the first time and got to know him and everything, and felt good about the direction he seemed to be headed from our superficial observations. About a week later, on the night of Christmas Eve, we stopped by for our next appointment with him that we had previously scheduled, but nobody answered. Found out a few days later that he had shot his wife in the stomach that morning during an argument. I don't know the exact details, but I heard it had something to do with his PTSD and bipolar disorder. He's now in prison for the next 40 years. Granted, I hadn't known him for long, but I was absolutely floored. Story 19. I was friends with Andre Thomas and his wife Laura Boren and went to school with them my whole life. Used to hang out with both of them. Andre was a brilliant kid but neglected his whole life and a bit timid. He ended up cutting out Laura's and his kids' hearts because the devil told him to. He put them in a paper bag and put them in his pocket. In prison, he plucked his eye out because he read it in the Bible and ate it. Pulled out the other one later. Snap! Also went to school with a guy who raped and murdered a 10-month-old baby and threw it into a cellar. He was a creepy kid, grungy wannabe rock, goth. Had 0 friends and constantly doing weird shit like pissing in bottles and bringing them to school. Last, I remember seeing him before he committed this murder was at a pep rally 8th grade. Story 20. My childhood friend killed his parents. His dad was my dad's best friend. Red flags? Drinking at an extremely young age, like 9. Adult videos also at that age. He never had a sense of right, wrong, cruelty to animals. It reads like a profile of a future murderer. Heavy drug use did the rest of the work, and he killed both of them for oxy. Since he was my friend, I guess I missed it all at the time, but my parents got me the F away from him quickly once I mentioned some things to them. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update.